In this video, we're going to learn to model with Thicken in the freeform workspace in Fusion 360. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to carry on with our Racecar brake duct system, and this time we're going to talk about modeling using Thicken in the freeform workspace. Now, this is something that we've mentioned before in some of the previous 46 videos that we've done in this series, but we haven't really modeled with it. Now, there's a couple reasons for that. One is because it's extremely tricky. If forms is a difficult thing to do, modeling with a thickened form is 10 times harder. So there are a lot of things that we need to consider and work on when we're doing this. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to go into the bodies folder. I'm going to hide everything, and then I'm going to edit the freeform model. Now, if you didn't follow along with the last video and model your own, you can go ahead and download the data set inside of the description of this video. So the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to take the body 1, and use Control-C and Control-V to make an exact copy of it. I don't want to mess with the original, and this way I always have a copy to go back to. Remember that when we're working in freeform models, we are doing direct modeling. So we're not going to take this exact same brake duct, but we're going to make some changes, and we're going to talk about ways in which we can use the Thicken tools to our advantage. So because the back end was matched to an extruded cylinder and it already has the tolerance on it and it has all these divisions, what I'm going to do is double click this back edge and hit delete to get rid of it. Then I want to create just basically a wide single opening here. I'm going to do that by double clicking on this edge. You will notice that when we look at this edge, because it was broken up with those T-points, that it ends up having a lot of divisions. And this is actually problematic for us. If we go to insert an edge, it's only going to allow us to go up to the next T-point. So you can see I can't actually go all the way to the other edge. Because of that, in order to fix it, we would have to go to weld vertices, and we would need to start welding these vertices to the ones next to them. And this can start to get pretty ugly and time consuming. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to delete this back edge completely. And then I'm just going to continue to work with this form as I did originally. So hold down Alt, extrude this back. I'm going to scale it down a little bit, maybe rotate it, and then do this one more time, just extrude it back. Once again, we're not creating the exact same thing that we did before, but we're going to talk about how we can use the freeform tool Thicken and model with that. Okay, so now that we have the shape that we're working on, let's say that we wanted to create a solid body from this, but we wanted to completely divide the airflow in this opening. Now, I'm going to fix this opening just a little bit because it's going to drive me crazy. I'm going to go ahead and scale that down, and I think that looks okay. All right, so if we want to divide the opening up and we want to make this a solid, there's a couple different ways that we can do it. We can do this with surface tools after the fact, we can do it with solid tools after the fact, or we can continue to work directly here in freeform models. But just like everything that we do, there is going to be a process that's important to follow. Whenever we start a freeform design, we're always working in box display for as long as possible, and we want to use box display to our advantage. So in this case, when I'm looking at box display, I want to manipulate this by scaling it down, and I want to see consistent transitions between everything. Once I'm happy with the way things look in box display, then I can start worrying about smooth display, making sure my corners are correct, making sure it fits the shape that I want. After all that is done, if I want to move into more detail in certain areas, then I need to start dividing it up. When we're working on the concept or the rough shape and we insert edges or we insert points, we're using the simple insertion method. When we do that, what this means is that the edge that gets inserted is not going to change the box display at all. It's simply going to put an edge right in the middle. And what this means for our smooth display is that the curvature in those areas is going to have a ripple in it, because the flat faces that are next to each other, what's going to end up happening is the tangency is driving that across two edges, and it really doesn't know what to do in the middle, and it begins to cause problems. So once we're happy with the shape, when we start inserting edges, we want to make sure that we're using the exact insertion mode. Now, this is a little bit tricky to do because exact is going to divide up more than just the edge that you're adding. So in this case, when it adds it, these two edges are no longer straight relative to each other. It actually adds a little bit of curvature to it. If I undo this and I redo it, you can see that things are changing ever so slightly. If I go back and I do this again, but this time I use the simple insertion mode, and we undo and redo, you can see that none of the faces are changing. Everything is staying exactly as it was. It's just adding that new edge between it. So again, this is an important consideration. Another way that we can do this is we can use subdivide to divide the entire body or selected faces up. Once again, we can do simple or exact. Exact will maintain the shape, so if you're happy with the shape, it's important that we do that. We can also use the specify option to determine where we want those divisions. If we don't want to divide it up in a lot of subdivisions in all areas, we can decide to do more in one direction than the other. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use 2 for the length and 4 for the width and say OK. Once again, in smooth display, we should still have the exact same shape. Now it's just divided up quite a bit more. Next step for me is going to be modify and thicken. We're going to select the form body. We need to determine what we want the edges to be. If you want a smooth transition, then you use soft. If you want creases added to the corners, you use sharp. The direction is going to be normal. In this case, if we use an axis, it's really not going to make much sense. So we're going to use sharp and normal and say OK. At this stage, remember it's not being captured in the timeline. This is all direct and destructive modeling. At this stage, what we now have is an inside and an outside of our form. If we were to finish the form right now, what we end up getting is a solid. Now it's telling us that there is a problem here. Let's go ahead and try to finish the form again. And it tells us there's a problem, but it doesn't really show us the problem here. It's probably in these corners. So what I'm going to do before I go too much further is I'm going to try to do repair body and see if I can find any problems. I don't see anything off the top of my head, but I'm going to allow it to repair it. And let's see if we can convert this to a solid. It still tells us that there's a self-intersection, and this is something that we would want to fix before we move forward at all. Generally, the self-intersections will happen when we have too many divisions and corners. It could be on one of the edges. It could potentially be in the original body as well. So let's go ahead and just check the conversion once more, T-spline self-intersection, and what we can do here is we can take a look at this corner here, and this is likely where the problem is. So I'm going to take this edge, and I'm going to just pull it out. You can see that there is a self-intersection here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of some of these edges in the corners that I likely don't need to try to fix that. I'm going to check the other side. That looks okay. Or check the conversion again, and now you can see that the errors are removed. We convert it, it can be converted to a solid now. So these are things that we want to check before we get too far in the geometry. So now that we know it can be converted to a solid, what's the next step for us? Well, I do want to remove some of these edges in the corners that I probably just have too many. Let's go ahead and just remove a couple of these. We can always go back and forth to smooth display and just make sure that it still looks okay. I'm just going to take a couple more of these out. There's no sense in having too many divisions if it's not really adding to the geometry. But when we subdivide something, subdividing it is going to divide everything. So once again, just double check your shapes. All right, now I'm pretty happy with that. So the next step for me is to divide this up. Now, if I want to divide it up all the way front to back, what I can do is I can take these sets of faces here, and then I can take the sets on the top and bridge them together. If I want it to be just partially divided, I could only take a handful of them. It just kind of depends on what your end goal is here. Remember that we're dealing with the inside and the outside of the form now. This is going to convert to a solid body. So we could get rid of and delete a bunch of faces, and we could patch the geometry back together to make a solid section over here, working with the inside and the outside consistently. But what we're going to do is we're going to divide the center up using modify and bridge. So on the top, I'm not going to divide it up all the way at the front edge. I'm going to start back a couple, and I am going to take it all the way to the back edge. Now with this tool, we want to make sure that we have the same number of faces. So we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And we want to find the matching ones on the bottom. So we're going to go 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Another thing that's important is to make sure that the dot and the arrows are on the same location, top and bottom. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to say OK. And now you can see we've divided this up with solid. So I'm going to hold an Alt and 1 to turn this back into box display. And at this stage, now we can begin to manipulate the shape. So for example, if I want to take these inside edges and scale them, when we look at this in smooth display, you can see that now what we're doing is we're sort of scaling that down. If I want a tighter transition at the top and bottom, I can do that by inserting edges. I'm going to use the simple insertion mode, and I'm just going to take this and push it up relatively close to that edge. I'm going to do the same thing down here. Put it relatively close to that bottom edge. Alt and 1 to view this in box display. And once again, we want a little bit of transition. We don't want it to be completely straight. So what I'm going to do is scale this in. I'm going to do the same thing at the top. Take this and just scale it in horizontally just a little bit. Go back to smooth display. And now you can see we've got that transition. So at this stage, we can continue to work with this transition however we see fit. And you can see that we did maintain that crease on the back side. If I wanted to, I could push or scale some of these faces forward. So for example, I might want to move my pivot point maybe up front and then scale these down forward, which is going to bring that back edge in a little bit. And this is just, playing around with the shape, figuring out what works. This transition is probably less than ideal, and what we could do is we could go to modify and uncrease, and maybe uncrease this section right here and just see what it looks like. Now that doesn't really give us a very good transition. I'm going to repeat the uncrease, and I'm going to uncrease that entire back edge. And we get a little bit smoother transition, but these are still star points here. And star points are generally going to be problematic. I'm going to do Control Z. I'm going to undo and bring that crease back. And probably the better option is to set this in a little bit, or potentially add a crease to these back edges. So if I crease them, I get a harder edge here, and that's probably going to give me a better result overall. Let's try to convert this and finish this form. And now you can see that we've got a solid body. I'm going to go to Inspect, Section Analysis. Let's go ahead and pull this up until we find the solid. You can see here we've got a thin wall on the outside, and we've got this interior wall that's dividing those two airflow passages. So this is just one example of a way that we can use the Thicken in the Forms workspace to continue to work on our designs and add these additional elements that we might see fit. It's always important to think about working with surfaces or freeform bodies that are surfaces, to think about working on just a single face of your design. Now, that could be the inside or the outside, but you have to think about it as sort of those individual layers. If you look at a part that you have laying around, when you're creating a freeform model, you're only creating either the inside or the outside of the thickness of the part. That's a concept that really needs to kind of stick with you when you're using that type of modeling. Doing this with Thicken, once you get the basic shape down, can be a handy way to add some complexity to your design. But once again, it does really ramp up the difficulty you have in working with these types of models. Once you have to add this many divisions to continue working with it, it becomes quite the chore when you're trying to model in this manner. So for example, as I start to move things around and scale them down, I now have to consider not only the shape that I'm working with, but also the fact that I might be overlapping the outside and not able to convert the shapes. So these are all things that, again, are extremely important, and it's really difficult. So I don't suggest that people dive into using the Thicken modeling approach with freeform models. until you get really comfortable using them on just surfaces. It's much easier to do this after the fact with solid or surface tools and not do this with freeform tools just because the extra layer of complexity that happens. But it is possible, and maybe this will give you some inspiration or some insight into how you can apply this to yours. If you have any questions on this, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.